July 16th, 1945. The New Mexico desert is silent before dawn. At 5:29 a.m., the device designated Gadget detonates on a 100-foot steel tower at the Trinity test site in the Jornada del Muerto desert. The fireball expands to 600 feet in diameter in the first second. The temperature at the point of detonation reaches 10,000 times the surface temperature of the sun. The blast wave moves outward at nearly the speed of sound, flattening scrub brush and snapping the steel supports of observation towers positioned a mile from ground zero. The mushroom cloud rises to 38,000 feet. Windows shatter 120 miles away in Silver City. The yield is later calculated at 21 kilotons of TNT equivalent. The Manhattan Project has produced a functional nuclear weapon after 3 years of work, 130,000 workers, and approximately $2 billion in expenditure. The implosion lens design works. The plutonium core compresses symmetrically. The chain reaction initiates and sustains. 19 days later, Hiroshima is gone. But let's change one thing. The implosion lenses fail. Not dramatically, not in a way that announces itself clearly to the scientists watching from the observation bunker 10 miles southwest at base camp. The device detonates in the conventional sense, meaning the chemical explosive surrounding the plutonium core fires as designed, and Gadget's outer casing splits apart in a low-order event that scatters plutonium fragments across approximately a quarter mile of desert floor. The yield is measured in tons, not kilotons. The ground shakes. Dust rises. J. Robert Oppenheimer, standing at the observation post, does not quote the Bhagavad Gita. There is nothing to quote it about. The most expensive scientific program in American history has produced on July 16, 1945, a moderately large conventional explosion and a contaminated patch of New Mexico desert. The failure has a specific technical cause. The implosion lens design required that 32 explosive lenses surrounding the plutonium core detonate with a simultaneously measured in microseconds. The detonation wave had to arrive at every point on the surface of the core at the same instant, compressing the subcritical plutonium mass inward uniformly enough to achieve supercriticality. A timing error of even 1 microsecond in any single lens produced an asymmetric compression wave. The plutonium core shifted rather than compressed. Fission initiated partially and then quenched before the chain reaction could sustain itself. The explosive energy released by the chemical lenses alone was still substantial. It was simply not nuclear. In this scenario, the lens timing circuits carry a manufacturing defect that the quality control process at Los Alamos had not detected. The defect is small, the consequences are not. The Trinity failure report reaches Secretary of War Henry Stimson on July 18th. It reaches President Harry Truman at the Potsdam Conference 2 days later. Truman had arrived at Potsdam on July 15th, already knowing the Trinity test was scheduled. He'd been briefed on the project's expected yield, its delivery mechanism, and the operational plans for its use against Japan. The notification he receives on July 18th instead tells him that the device failed to achieve nuclear yield, that the implosion design requires fundamental redesign, and that Los Alamos estimates between 8 and 14 additional months before a corrected device can be ready for testing. The gun-type uranium weapon, Little Boy, remains a separate track, but Little Boy carries its own problems. The gun-type design uses uranium-235, and the entire American uranium enrichment program at Oak Ridge has produced enough U-235 for exactly one weapon by the summer of 1945. If that weapon is used operationally and fails to detonate, the United States has spent its entire uranium stockpile. The decision calculus changes completely. The Little Boy design had never been tested before deployment precisely because the physics were considered reliable enough and because the uranium supply was too limited for a test detonation. In the original timeline, confidence in the gun-type design was high enough that testing was deemed unnecessary. In this altered timeline, Gadget's failure introduces a level of institutional doubt that did not previously exist. The question being asked in Washington and Los Alamos throughout late July and August 1945 is whether the gun-type device will function correctly when it matters. The answer from the physicist is that it should. The answer from the military planners is that should is not good enough. The summer of 1945 without a functioning nuclear weapon looks like this. Operation Downfall. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands proceeds through its planning stages without the alternative that would have made it unnecessary. The first phase, Operation Olympic, targets Kyushu with a scheduled assault date of November 1st, 1945. The invasion force being assembled is the largest in the history of amphibious warfare. 14 divisions in the assault, 767,000 American troops committed committed to the initial landings, supported by a naval force of 3,000 ships. The planning estimates for American casualties in Olympic alone range from 31,000 in the most optimistic projections to 456,000 in the most pessimistic. Japanese planners operating under the Ketsugo defensive strategy have positioned 600,000 troops in Kyushu and are manufacturing kamikaze aircraft at a rate of 1,000 per month, specifically to target the invasion fleet. The conventional bombing campaign against Japan continues through the summer and fall. By August 1945, in the original timeline, LeMay's B-29s had already burned roughly 67 Japanese cities. The firebombing of Tokyo on March 9th to 10th killed between 80,000 and 100,000 people in a single night and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. In this altered timeline, that campaign does not stop. It escalates. With no nuclear option available and an invasion scheduled for November, the strategic bombing effort intensifies through August, September, and October. Japan's rail network is targeted systematically. Rice shipments from Kyushu to Honshu are disrupted. The oil refinery network, already largely destroyed by this point, is attacked again to prevent any residual capacity from functioning. The blockade maintains its strongholds. American submarines have already reduced Japanese merchant shipping by roughly 90%. Food caloric intake in Japanese cities has dropped to approximately 1,500 calories per day by mid-1945. The blockade is not lifted in this timeline. It tightens. What the bombing campaign and blockade cannot do is produce a Japanese surrender on their own timelines. The evidence for this comes from the historical record itself. Japan did not surrender following the firebombing of Tokyo. It did not surrender following the firebombing of Osaka, Kobe, or Nagoya. The military faction within the Japanese government that controlled the surrender decision was committed to fighting the invasion under the Ketsugo strategy and accepting catastrophic civilian casualties as a necessary loss. The Soviet declaration of war against Japan on August 8, 1945, which in the original timeline coincided with the Nagasaki bombings, carries more weight in some historical analysis as a factor in Japanese surrender calculations. In this altered timeline, the Soviet declaration still occurs on schedule. The Soviets invade Manchuria on August 9th, regardless of what happened in New Mexico on July 16th. The Japanese army group Kwantung, numbering approximately 700,000 troops, collapses within days. Manchuria falls. Korea becomes a combat zone. The northern home island of Hokkaido comes under threat of Soviet invasion. The combination of Soviet entry and the continued American blockade and bombing does produce pressure on the Japanese government. What it does not produce, based on the internal records of Japanese deliberations available after the war, is certainty of surrender before November 1st. The peace faction within the government, led by figures like Foreign Minister Shigenoro Togi, argues for negotiated terms through Soviet mediation. The military faction argues that the invasion must be met and that American casualties will eventually force a negotiated peace. The deadlock that existed in the original timeline before Hiroshima reasserts itself. August passes, September passes, the invasion planning continues. Little Boy is eventually deployed. The decision is made in late September to use the gun-type device operationally, accepting the risk that it has not been tested. The weapon is loaded aboard a B-29 and the mission launches on October 9th, 1945. The target is Kokura. The bomb releases at 31,600 feet. The firing mechanism initiates. A uranium projectile travels down the gun barrel and strikes the uranium target at the opposite end. The critical mass is achieved. The chain reaction initiates and sustains. The yield is approximately 15 kilotons. Kokura is destroyed. Roughly 60,000 people are killed in the initial detonation and the fires that follow. The untested design works exactly as the physicists at Los Alamos predicted it would. The Japanese response to Kokura's destruction differs from the response to Hiroshima in one important way. By October 1945, Japan has already absorbed Soviet entry into the war and 3 additional months of conventional bombing. The institutional capacity to absorb a single catastrophic event and continue functioning has been further degraded. The military faction's argument that American casualties during invasion would force a negotiated peace has been weakened by the continued application of blockade and bombardment at a scale Japan cannot counter. The Kokura weapon does not arrive in a country that was otherwise stable. It arrives in a country that has been losing ground on every front for months longer than in the original timeline. The surrender deliberations begin within 48 hours of the Kokura bombing. Emperor Hirohito convenes the Supreme Council for the direction of the war on October 11th. The deadlock within the council Council follows the same pattern it followed after Hiroshima. The Emperor again intervenes to break the deadlock. The surrender announcement broadcasts on October 14, 1945. The formal surrender ceremony takes place on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on November 2, 1945, one day after the originally scheduled date for the Olympic landings in Kyushu. The war ends approximately 3 months later than it did in the original timeline. The death toll in those 3 additional months is not a simple calculation. The firebombing campaign between August and October 1945 kills somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 additional Japanese civilians, depending on the targets and intensity of operations. Soviet military operations in Manchuria and Korea produce additional casualties among Japanese troops and civilian populations under Japanese administration. The prisoner of war population held by Japan, which was dying at a significant rate due to starvation and execution, experiences 3 additional months of those conditions. The death toll among Allied prisoners in this period is measurable in thousands. The blockade-induced famine conditions affecting Japanese civilians continue through the summer and fall. Kokura itself accounts for 60,000 deaths on October 9th. The implosion lens defect found in Gadget is corrected through a redesign process completed in April 1946. The corrected design is tested successfully at Bikini Atoll in July 1946. The plutonium implosion weapon joins the American arsenal 8 months behind the original schedule. The program records the Trinity failure as a quality control failure in the explosive lens manufacturing process. The precise defect is identified, documented, and corrected. The physics that Oppenheimer and his team had assembled were correct. The engineering had failed at one specific point. The weapon, once that point was corrected, worked exactly as designed. The altered timeline ends with the same result as the original, just later at higher cost, and with Kokura rather than Hiroshima as the name that carries the weight of what a functional nuclear weapon actually means when it arrives over a city.